Enrolling in the Academy is really simple. You'll just go to our website, wblinc.org/academy. And when you get here, you'll see our main page and you can click enroll and it'll take you to this form where you're just gonna fill this out. It'll take you about 5 minutes. Once you submit this, you're enrolled in the Academy and you'll receive an email from me so you can pick the classes you'd like to take and join our Academy family. So we're an after-school program rooted in hip hop. So we have a bunch of classes that you may find interesting. You can go right to our website and go to our classes tab and you'll see some of them, from performing arts like hip hop theater, spoken word, hip hop dance, some of our business classes that are like a boss and walk it like I talk it, which would be more arts management and entrepreneur based. And then we also have things like our music classes, MCing and rapping and beat production and DJing. You can go to wblinc.org/academy to enroll.
What's going on, world? It's yours truly, Mazi Mutafa, Executive Director of Words, Beats, and Life, here for episode 22 of No New Leaders. And happy MLK Day. Today is the Rev Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s actual birthday. Tomorrow is the federal holiday. And we decided, because the show is called No New Leaders, we thought we'd talk a little bit about MLK. And I'm not even going to lie. In some ways, this show topic was inspired not just by the holiday, but by participating in events that people are hosting in the name of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me, at least, is how it is that the legacy of one of the most well-documented, most written about African-American leaders in the history of the United States is so misunderstood, so misrepresented. And I think it's critical that we begin to have a conversation about how the federal holiday really becomes an opportunity to get to know the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, what his actual legacy is, what it is that he really stood for, what he really fought for, some of the reasons that he was murdered. And I think that it's important to have that conversation for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that many young people are given nothing but the I Have a Dream speech, which is a seminal speech in his history, in the history of the nation. But even the I Have a Dream speech is still also misunderstood. Basic things about that speech, like what was the name of the march? It wasn't called the March on Washington. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. Those words being taken out take the event out of the context that the event was organized in. And so why is that important? Why would it be important that it just be called the March on Washington and not the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice? Why were they marching for jobs and justice? Why was he dreaming about jobs and justice? Why was he working? Why was he part of a movement that was working to promote jobs and justice? I don't know. I mean, I really do, but this is a great segue for me to go ahead and bring in my co-host, Carrie. What's going on, Carrie?
What up? How you doing?
I'm doing very well, and I'm actually really excited. And it's interesting because I'm not going to lie, I'm one of those people who is much more of a Malcolm person than I am a Martin person. However, that fact doesn't negate my understanding of the importance of Martin's legacy, his true legacy, and why it is that we are given a representation of him that is not true. Another example, right? I was just talking about an event I was at this weekend celebrating his legacy. One of the other things is I got to hear from adults and young people that his legacy is peace. Martin Luther King was a man of peace. And it's like, do you know that most of the time he was arrested for disturbing the peace? That peace doesn't mean justice. That peace doesn't mean equality. Peace doesn't even necessarily mean freedom. Like, on a lot of levels, prisons are filled with peace imposed by structure, order, and a kind of military set of guards. So peace doesn't mean justice. It doesn't mean freedom. Doesn't mean equality, number one. But number two, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King I know talked about the importance of nonviolence, but nonviolence through direct action. So it wasn't just like don't do anything. It was do something, but when violence comes to you, you have to actually meet that violence with love. Like, that's a radical Christian, Buddhist, you know, philosophical approach to violence that somehow gets translated as peace. But like, if it was peace, that violence would not have come. If it wasn't disturbing the peace, if it wasn't disturbing the kind of national order, the police would not have responded the way they did. The National Guard would not have responded the way they did. Local elected officials would not have responded the way they did. But they responded because through direct action, nonviolent direct action, he was able to challenge what it is that people were doing, what it is that people were saying, what kind of laws existed in communities, particularly that affected African Americans. At that time, African Americans were the largest second racial group in the United States of America. We see now that the Latino population represents 19% of the population, and last time I checked, African Americans represent 14% of the population. So we're in a different America. We're living through different times, but that doesn't mean that the messages and approaches and philosophies of Rev Dr. Martin Luther King are not still relevant. It actually means they're more relevant because on some levels, if you look at the kind of economic devastation experienced, particularly by communities of color more broadly and African Americans in particular in the United States, there's some reports that say that the economic gaps between Black and white are greater now than when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was alive. So if one of the things that he was fighting for, advocating for, petitioning for was jobs and justice, and we still are fighting for justice and still fighting for jobs and economic opportunity, it seems like his message should be more relevant today than ever. So the question becomes, how do we use MLK Day? In America right now, if we're lucky, people use it as a day of service, a day to go out and do good for other people, right? Go to neighborhoods and clean up, volunteer in soup kitchens, kind of the same way that people use Thanksgiving or even Christmas in some instances. It's just kind of this general holiday to give back. But what would happen if we actually use this holiday, this time, to reflect, to actually take the time to go to stores and buy books and read about what it is that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was doing, why it is that he thought it was important to build coalitions across identities, why it was that his speeches were written and archived in a way that you can access them. Taking the time, and let's suppose your person doesn't want to read. I know lots of people don't want to read, myself included sometimes. There's a ton of interviews on YouTube. There's a ton of opportunities to be able to see what it is that was really controversial about the Reverend Doctor, particularly towards the end of his life. Why it is that so many people, not just in the government, but in the clergy community, or more specifically in the African American community, were opposed to him. Why were there so many children that were involved in the rallies that he was organizing? What was it about his message that appealed to young people? And I think in my own effort to go out and buy books to include in an event that we're hosting tomorrow, I was actually really surprised at how many of the books about Martin Luther King that are available in bookstores are actually targeted to children. Like, I actually had to go to 4 different bookstores to get 7 books for adults about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So I'm proposing that, like, even if you're not a huge fan, learn why he was doing what he was doing. Why was he an enemy of the state? What was it that disrupted or bothered clergy about his approach to taking, his own understandings of the gospel of Jesus Christ and applying it through direct action, nonviolent direct action? There are reasons. There's a reason why we only get I Have a Dream and not Chaos or Community. But I've been talking because I wanted to give you time to come back, Carrie. So, Carrie, let me let you talk before your Wi-Fi drops again. So how are you chiming in? I know some stuff's happening in Baltimore related to Dr. King too.
What's up? Yeah. Can y'all see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because I had to switch to my mobile phone. Comcast Business, we gotta talk because I don't understand. Something is not working right. But yeah, as we talk about the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I love how you talked about peace versus justice versus non-direct action. And there's so much when we talk about rising up. I could go to a good friend of mine named Baba Darrow, and he always says, rise up, F this, the other word that you use for poo-poo. I won't do those words. But I think it's important because when we frame him as though he was some sort of person who was non-confrontational, or that conflict is somehow something that should only happen in some like kowtow type of way, then we stop to think about the actual power of anger and the strategy that he had behind it. And you're thinking about at the time period, you had several different theories of movement happening in real time at one time. So you had the Nation of Islam, you had the Panthers that were growing, you had, the growth of more radicalized white movements, and all these different things were happening at the same time that also the police state, the government was getting stronger and stronger on how they attacked political activists. So for Dr. King, when we think about that, it's not so much about like, oh, peace, peace, peace. It's more so about what is the strategy behind peace. And I think oftentimes they talk about it, but they don't really talk about the propaganda, how you address and create your own propaganda. We think about propaganda as a bad term, but for him, he's looking at how do we change the narrative of showcasing, look, we are not animals. We're all in suits. We look good. We're doing simple things that anybody should be able to do, like vote or sit at a counter or, ride a bus and have any seat that we want because we're all paying the same price. All of these things are important, and they had to showcase the violence, the true, to create this visual discussion on the differences between the reaction of the state versus the reaction of people who are trying to live life in a way that makes sense, and the police state is actively attacking them and making sure that people see that this is not something that is normal. They had to stop normalizing the violence of segregation by showcasing it. And you can't showcase it. There's like a whole subset of people who will blame the victim if people try and fight back, which is a problem. And we saw that a lot.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it 1,000%. So I got invited to an event that was held at a police station. So I was listening to police tell young people about the legacy of Martin Luther King, and they framed it as peace. His legacy was peace. And I think, like, I was sitting in the audience wondering, are they confusing Rev Dr. Martin Luther King with Rodney King? Because he was the one that said, "Can't we all get along?" And I'm not under any delusions about the fact that Rev Dr. Martin Luther King was a Christian minister, but he also had bodyguards that carried guns because he knew that violence could come. He also went to places that were dangerous to talk to people about what they were doing wrong. And so like this idea, like, that's not a strategy for peace. That's a strategy for justice. That's a strategy for equity. And so if we're going to talk about this man who's not here to speak for himself and to talk about the things that he said in his own lifetime, the way he talked about framing injustice in America in economic terms, like responding to the idea that African Americans need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they ain't got no boots. Literally left slavery with nothing. No 40 acres and a mule, no reparations. Was really clear about the fact that there was an economic piece to justice, not just good feelings. And somehow, on some levels, I feel like America has decided that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was basically American Jesus, where like he was sacrificed for us to have a better America, as opposed to like this was a man who was murdered in the prime of his life for advocating for poor people, advocating for workers, advocating against war in Vietnam. And at the end of the day, he had a really large megaphone that people were paying attention to, and that there was a great fear in the larger power structure that he would sway more people against war, militarism, the military-industrial complex, not just racial justice, not just poverty, but the way that America operated in the world. Because remember, a huge part of the civil rights movement was about a kind of public shaming of America, who goes around the world lifting up democracy, lifting up equality, but doesn't practice it at home.
Yeah.
You know, this anyway. So I don't mean to cut you off. I just think that it's.
Oh, yeah.
I think we have to be advocates for what actually happened, and make sure that our children and our friends and our children's parents make the time to read what was said, to Google videos of speeches, to if you're gonna read the I Have a Dream speech, read the whole speech. What was it about? It wasn't just about dreaming about equality for his children and standing next to people that were different than them. Like, it was about, like, we have an integrated table, but we can't get the same food because we don't got the same kind of resources.
Yeah.
So it wasn't integration for its own sake, but it really was about how to, like, he even said it in the I Have a Dream speech, like, I come here to collect on a promissory note. You owe us. You said you would pay and you haven't. And because you haven't, we're still suffering through these conditions. That's powerful.
That's very powerful. And I think we're still suffering in a lot of those conditions. You know, when we think about Dr. King's message, one, I love how you said we need to tell the whole story. So then it's a question of, how do we have those conversations about things like COINTELPRO? You know, how do we have those conversations about what it means to create radical change, knowing that you will face some levels of scrutiny from people who don't want to see that change happen? And even more so than that, how do we talk about Dr. King, not just from a perspective of integrationism, but also from the perspective of what the message and the movement did to bring Black people together. So, for example, here in Baltimore, we've had a bit of a conundrum because over the Martin Luther King parade, right? We've had a lot of killings lately, and, you know, a lot of just different really harmful things that are happening, you know, whether it's, you know, shootings of high school students at Popeyes, or, you know, just the day-to-day struggles of life. And so for our mayor, he was really adamant that we need to have this march. So adamant that he was willing to push for the termination of one of the employees who was responsible for making sure that it happened. And they didn't. They were just going to do a service day instead of a march. And I think the pomp and circumstance, the actual theater, I don't think we think about a lot. The theater of movement and what that does for building movement. So yes, you can have lots of service days, but does that create the theater of movement that pulls people in for longer term? And so for Dr. King, he was very good at building the theater of movement. And, you know, not just Dr. King, but the movement itself, and him as a main character in this theater. He was able to bring out these large audiences, but what do you do after the fact? Every year we have a service day, every year we might have a march, but what do we do after the march? And that's where organizing comes in. So important. And I think we oftentimes do not talk about, one, the power of movement, but two, how movement changes when there are different power structures, when the organizational structure changes. So even when we think about the expansion of it, people think that, you know, like you mentioned how Dr. King is like American Jesus, where we create these hero theories about one person being able to move all these people, forgetting that there's these whole organizational structures that are so important and so key. And, you know, as we're talking about knowing leaders, it's also important to think about the larger base of people that they're moving and how that queen bee, for a lack of a word, moves the whole hive. And if the whole hive isn't strong enough to create change, that one speaker will just be one speaker. And what we've seen since the passing or since the assassination of Dr. King, is that these movements tend to amplify this one leader model that totally disregards that you have to have a strong infrastructure, and that infrastructure is just not sexy to the type of kind of outward, leadership that we're showcasing, which is based off of, being able to lead the show, being able to have colorful words, being able to rhyme things out. But do you have the strength and capacity to build your base? And when they assassinate that Queen Bee, the whole purpose of it is to make people fearful of being one, make people fearful of joining, collectives, of supporting ideas, because it is seen as either fraught with disorganization and corruption. So much like the church, people get fearful. So that's what I'm really interested to see, is like, when we talk about building out the justice that we need, what does that look like in building out structures of organizations so that you can make space for that, so that a collective can build? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we gotta get past that, because I cannot name a single institution that exists on planet Earth that has no corruption, has not, like, I know of, there's not no churches, ain't no mosques, ain't no synagogues that are 100%, guilt-free of anything. Like, people talking right now about the involvement of particular communities in the slave trade, particular institutions in the slave trade, whether those are banking institutions, or places of worship, or people that attended those places of worship. No institution, no community, no organization that can be built by people will be perfect. The question is, what is the mission of the organization? And is it big enough that when the person who leads it decides to no longer lead it, or the people decide that that person is no longer the leader, can it continue on? Because the truth is, Dr. King had an organization. He had employees. The people that were standing next to him when he was assassinated, they worked for him. They were on the job. They weren't volunteers. And so this idea that there was there was an infrastructure, but those people made a really clear decision. They said that the way that we're going to make change is not by being a separate organization, or even just by integrating society. We're going to integrate the government. We're going to go ahead and take over places of public office and run municipalities, whether that's, looking at elected folks in Atlanta or in Washington, D.C., looking at people in Congress who were a part of that same movement. Folks that got knocked in the head were eventually people helping to pass legislation. So they made a real clear decision that the way for them to move forward was to not just be an advocate for what government would do, but to actually work within government to advance a set of political priorities. The question becomes, what happened to community organizations after that? When those people decided, we're not going to do this community organizing, we're going to go into the government, what happened to the organizations? There are plenty of, one of the things I did as an undergrad, I read a book called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual by Harold Cruz. I should actually make that mandatory reading for every person I ever meet on planet Earth. But it's a book like this big, and it's all about the history of the civil rights movement and all these organizations that came into existence that no longer exist, mostly because they were fighting each other over money. Who was going to get the money from the patrons? Would you say nonprofit industrial complex? So this idea that money matters to build infrastructure, to build institutions, is real. So does community accountability. So does an agenda that people can clearly hold leadership accountable to if you're a community-based organization. And so part of the challenge is, as I was saying, the thing that people almost never talk about, other than the Montgomery bus boycott, the people who you see in the black and white footage having hoses turned on them and dogs sicked on them are mostly teenagers. They're kids. They were people who didn't have anything to lose but their literal life and their literal limb. But they were willing to put themselves on the line for a future that they thought was worth fighting for. So now, if we live in a time where leaders, elected and non-elected, are all elders, they've all got something to lose. So we're fortunate to live in a time, unfortunately, you talking about gun violence a second ago, where young people are standing up around gun violence and not seeing the kinds of results that they would hope for, but they also are not recognizing the civil rights movement was a decades-long movement. that had adult leaders but had young people on the front lines. Go ahead, Carrie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And what I'm also seeing just in general movement building in the environmental justice sector is that you start to see those generational lows. Like, yes, you have youth who are on the front lines, and you also have a lot of elders. A lot of elders have been stepping up, a lot of retirees, people who can, who have the time, to go out and have a voice in these different ways. And I think a lot about that as far as generational responsibilities. Once you get into your, later 30s, if you decide to have children, or your 20s or whatever, your priorities change. And so it's all about, I think it's interesting because as the civil rights movement just, grew up, you do have the John Lewises and the Bobby Rushes and all these people who are going into Congress and who are getting these good jobs, so that they can continue that movement. But they also have to make a lot of compromises because the movement is now sustaining their families in a different way, like organizing in a federal level is now sustaining things. So the biggest, I think, fault is that those batons, when people started getting comfortable and thinking about building generational wealth and putting their kids in private schools and all this different stuff, they never passed those batons properly. I don't know what happened with Generation X, love y'all, but where y'all at? Like, you had Barack, but then where's the rest of Generation X? Where are y'all at? And how do we, bring in those conversations a little bit different when it also becomes like beyond just, wanting to be radicalized and having the capacity to, but also needing to make sure that you can pay your bills and things of that nature. Where, why didn't they pass that baton to the next generation? And why are we just now starting to see Generation X step into their leadership? And when some of y'all are in your 50s and 60s almost.
Yeah, to be honest, I would disagree with you. I definitely think that the batons were passed. I think that we have an outsized view on how big the movement was, especially if you're thinking nationally. Like, a lot of the things that we point to as triumphs, those are super hyper local activities, whether it was the sanitation strike that Dr. King spoke at before he was assassinated, or the Montgomery bus boycott. That those were things that happened hyper local. So hyper local organizing, sometimes driven by people who were outsiders, the outside agitators, in terms of the Freedom Summer. And so when we think about where all y'all at, like, I think the truth is that because we're constantly fed the March on Washington, we think that there was really this massive national movement that people were a part of, as opposed to a well-organized, small, impactful, local set of organizations and organizers that had their impact locally that then trickled its way up to federal. So this injustice is happening in Alabama is also happening in Tennessee, is also happening in Washington, D.C. The only way to fix that is through federal legislation. So then you begin to advocate for national policy that's really designed to address hyper local problems that are economic, that are like, and on some levels we see a kind of revisiting of this right now with the Supreme Court deciding that businesses don't have to serve everybody. They don't have to provide services to everybody if they don't want to, if it's against their religious objection, which I can only imagine at the time, serving Black people next to white people would have been against most white people in the South's religious objections. And so the idea that what you think about, what's happening in the sky or after you die gets to decide how you treat me here is just some BS that got called out by young people, by some clergy, by some rabbis, by some imams. But the question becomes, how does that story get told in a way that is true, so that young people understand that like, I would love 10 years from now to go to that same event and have those young people say, Dr. King was a fighter. He fought for change. He put his body on the line. He put his intellect on the line to argue for the humanity, the shared humanity of all human beings. And
Yeah.
that was in part inspired by international movements, but it was looking at his very local community and what it meant to be Black in America at that time. And so
Yeah.
you were about to say something.
No, I agree totally. And I also hope that 10 years from now, those young people feel confident enough and safe enough to say that to law enforcement in their face and say, no, Dr. King was a fighter. And I think the biggest fear that we have, and you talk about this when you talk about the narrative, it's not just the law enforcement. I've seen Republicans who hate everything that Dr. King has stand for, who then use his same quotes, or, use some of the same framework in a different way, even utilizing his children in some regards, and that's a whole nother story. So I hope that people feel safe. And that is a piece of the legacy that Dr. King was fighting for, was so that a young person doesn't have to feel fear when an agent of the state is in their midst.
So one of the questions becomes, if that's the goal that we have, how do we get there? I feel like one of the answers is what I said, which is getting them access to actual books. I think one of the answers is not just using the holiday as a time for service, but for a time of learning. Like, I had this great conversation. I'm not a person that celebrates Kwanzaa, but I had a great conversation with Substantial about Kwanzaa and its principles and how it is that he works to incorporate the principles of Kwanzaa into his life and his business year round. And so with this, I'm wondering, like, why aren't there, or maybe I just don't know about the existence of book clubs where people are reading and dissecting and talking about the relevance of the things that Rev Dr. King Jr. talked about, wrote about, worked towards. Because as I think about his legacy, like, in the greater populace, his legacy is peace. He's a man of peace. But I think in the activist community, his legacy is new interpretations of disturbing the peace, right?
Yeah.
So we could talk about the people who go out on highways and put their bodies on the line to create traffic, which personally I think is a terrible strategy, because ultimately they got the disturbance part, but they missed the part of getting people on their side. The people who are sitting in traffic, who were just driving home, who weren't doing anything wrong but having a car, are going to resent those people that did that. So you look at another example, we could think about things like the die-ins or the sit-ins or the walkouts. Where's the agenda that's also backing that? When people went to jail for marching, there were people organized with bail to be able to get them out. So people didn't need to stay in jail for long periods of time. There's a level of organizing. There's a thinking about what's the ultimate goal, what are the methods that would get us there, and how do we take care of our people? If we're going to ask people to put themselves on the line, how do we make sure that they're good in terms of the legal ramifications? Go ahead, Carrie.
No, I totally agree. I also think that it's really hard for any generation at this point because of the amount of information that is given to us at all times. There are book clubs. There are lots of book clubs. There are podcasts. There are all these things. It is an overload of information. And what happens is that the hottest key point is the one that gets picked up. So that's the question of, like, how do you make that hot take into a less than a minute short, because that is the level of attention span that people have for information nowadays. There's also the reality that I'm really thinking about this in the form of the algorithm. And how do you move people through algorithms to action instead of depression or complacency, and feeling like there's not a possibility to create the change that they want unless they go to some like Hotep extreme. So that's a good question to me, is like, how do you actually make this information that's actionable and useful into bite-size nibbles that people will actually eat?
I mean, I think my answer to that would be we can't pander to the lowest common denominator. We actually have to ask people to do more. So, like as an example, one of the things we started doing this year, this August, for the first time, we started celebrating Black August because we wanted to talk about the legacy of political prisoners in the African American community. That's not Dr. King, but like just like that Kwanzaa piece, like there are multiple opportunities during the year to be able to educate people about things they think they already know. But I really do think like it's almost as simple as saying like putting out a graphic that says not a man of peace, a man of justice. You know what I'm saying? With the but I also think it's a question of like thinking about how does this old strategy still work? You know those people that go out on the highway to block traffic? Is that usually for the environment? No, that's usually around police brutality, right? So what if those same people, instead of deciding to block traffic, since Dr. King was marching for jobs and justice, and part of that was also the desegregation of housing, what if they did sit-ins in wealthy neighborhoods where the people who you're blocking are the people who are going to the place you literally are not allowed to live because you don't make enough money? Like what if
I
they
mean,
actually started?
yeah. Not to say I think people have tried that, but you know, it's a lot of well, one is like what is the walking traffic? What's the actual foot traffic? Who's watching, paying attention when you do this sit-in, right? And so the attention isn't so much about like, yes, you're going to irritate people and people are going to be pissed. And now you've gotten their attention. And that's the thing about attention nowadays. It's not necessarily about whether it's supportive or good, or it's about, are you able to move people to action? People will be so irritated that it'll move people to action in some regard, right? And the thing about, I read this great article years ago in Town and Country magazine, and they were talking about the history of protests at the White House and how different presidents were impacted by it. And the thing about it is they would watch it all the time, but nothing moves but the money. Nothing moves but the money. And that's why you have those sit-ins or, you know, blockades that happen to stop the money from moving. You know, you're going to stop the money from moving. But if I'm just protesting in front of your gated community, I am more vulnerable to being killed and no one even knowing that happened. Because there's like, if there's no foot traffic, and then there's also the level of assumed right to privacy, the right to property rights that happens when you get on closer to someone's actual property.
So I mean, I'll be super transparent. I've been to probably 20 or 30 protests in my life. I'm not a protesting person. Personally, I am. Like, I actually think that part of the problem is that we, like, you know, what would be great to happen on Martin Luther King Day? A teach-in where people are teaching about his legacy, but also promoting literacy. Like, there's a ton of people around the country that are homeless. What if this racial justice movement, and a lot of those, the face of homelessness in America is a Black man, regardless of where you are in the country. The face of homelessness is a Black man. So what if all the folks that are advocating for jobs and justice decided that one of their goals was actually to eradicate homelessness? It's a big goal. But I saw a stat yesterday, I think, that said there's 3,000 homeless people in San Francisco. That's a lot of people to be homeless, but that's not a lot of people in San Francisco, in the sense that trying to actually make a difference in those folks' lives would actually make a discernible difference in the larger community. One, but two, I also think that much of what we do is an attempt to mimic what Dr. King did without really understanding. Like, he didn't just march. He marched into places that were dangerous, where people threw bricks at him. They didn't just come to DC and march around, you know, Freedom Plaza. The part of this was going to the places where injustice was, those property rights you talked about. And so I agree with you. I agree 100% with what you said. But I'm saying if we're going to look at the life and legacy as an example, look at the whole life. Look at the whole legacy, not just the parts that we feel comfortable doing, like gathering in Washington, but like gathering in communities that don't want us there, but we already live there. Our cousins,
Yeah.
our relatives, our aunts and uncles live under the boot of a local sheriff or a local township. Ferguson is a great example. Like but again, it's like using the examples from the civil rights movement, hyper local organizing with national support.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, and that's what it should be. But then it becomes a question of how people move their tactics. And for most people, the tactic for addressing homelessness is to have a conference. Why? I have no idea. You know, why are we having conferences instead of using that same funding to buy up blocks? Why is it so difficult to black box? Like, I'm here in Baltimore because that was my vision. I was like, I'm going to buy this house and then I'm going to try and figure out how to buy the whole block. Have I gotten there yet? No. You know, but it's a collective process. It's a collective journey. And it also requires a lot of collective capital. And that also is something where you have two different sides of a movement. You have the people who see Black capitalism as like the Jay-Z's, like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to, you know, buy the block, blah, blah, blah. And then you also have the people who are looking at it as like, this is wrong. And I want to build this social justice kind of American socialism vision. But where's the middle John? You know, where is that? How do we build that up in a real way? And I think there's so many lessons that people have pulled from previously. And there are also people who are actually doing it in real form, but they're not the ones that get media attention because it's not a sexy narrative. It's just not as newsworthy as someone blocking K Street, unfortunately.
No, I think that's true. But this is also kind of the moment we're living in where activists are provocateurs. Like this whole idea that the environmental movement gets attention now because they throw paint or food or whatever on works of art in museums. Like, really? I mean, you're right. You got some media coverage for the fact that the environment is trash, but you also look like an idiot. You also look like someone who doesn't value things that are of value to the general population. An idiot might be too strong, but you look like someone who's just trying to get attention, as opposed to a person that like has an organization, that has a community, that has a network, that has a set of people. Because the value in that conference you're describing is, how do we not duplicate efforts? Oh, you do literacy? Yeah. Cool. We don't need to do literacy. We can do wraparound services where you're a provider and I'm a provider, and we create a continuum of care if it's organized. That's the best interpretation of why there's a conference. The worst is it's just another way to spend money for people to have a job doing a thing that doesn't actually fix a problem, right? I don't have that cynical view for a couple of reasons. There will always be people that need, no matter what. So it's actually okay to solve problems, because there will always be more people who need the services that you provide. It's very unlikely, unless you're poorly managed, that you're going to go out of business by fixing people's problems. Fix people's problems. More people will come because they need help fixing their problems.
Yeah.
But again, I think a lot of this is going back to, what is the real story? What was the real intention? And then why do we have the image that we have of the Rev Dr. Martin Luther King? Why do we have a day of service instead of a day of scholarship? What are the brothers at Alpha Phi Alpha doing to promote one of their most famous members? Do they have a scholarship in his name where people are writing essays about the role of civil rights today? What's the NAACP doing, even though it's not his organization? What's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference doing? What's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King III? I know he's a reverend, but I don't know if he's a doctor. But Martin Luther King III doing to advance his father's legacy, other than holding marches? Like, I know he's about to do a march.
Martin Luther King III is supposed to be in DC for the Peace March tomorrow.
Yeah,
so
that's what I said. I said, other than marching, what's he doing?
I feel like we should do a survey, do an assessment, all those organizations, because I feel like even though we like to call them out, there are certain things that institutions like NAACP and Alpha Phi Alpha and even Southern Christian Leadership Council, that they're actually doing. When we talk about scholarships, there are lots of scholarships that all of the Divine Nine have been a part of. I know I was a debutante through back in the day through one of the Divine Nine.
No, I know that, but I meant specifically about his legacy, like you got to read something that he wrote to be able to write something. That's what I meant.
It would be
It's not
great.
just scholarships.
Yeah, I feel like it would be great. I mean, I think that there should be an assessment. And then once that assessment is done in a critical way, then you can present it and say, hey, these are the few things that come out of Dr. King's legacy that no one's touching. So when we talk about that conference and like who can touch that, who can do this work, who needs to be amplified more, and how do we get that to happen? So I don't know if anyone's done that. I feel like that's something that would be critical work.
I mean, I think on some levels they don't do it around Dr. King, but they do it around the state of Black America, which is the work of why am I blanking on their name? The Urban League does they're really the only civil rights organization that I'm aware of, consciously aware of, regularly still putting out papers about the state of Black America, making recommendations, etc. I mean, I know, like, in terms of civil rights organizations, I know places like the Joint Center, which is a think tank, they produce papers all the time. But the question is, who's reading them? Who's acting on them? What are we doing with the legacy? What are we doing to advance the legacy, to preserve the legacy, to ensure that we don't let our leaders become caricatures of what it is that other people think that they should be, could be, might have been, versus what they said they were, what they actually said they were working on doing.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I feel like there's some action items. I'm willing to see who's going to take the bait. Let's make this happen. Like, I really, feel like even when we talk about those state of Black America, state of the Black world, it still oftentimes is a language, but doesn't come with like really strategic action items. And when we talk about this, touch back on this idea of like government versus, movement, community-based movement, there are so much things that are happening right now that interweave the government and nonprofit. And a lot of that comes from the legacy that Dr. King and others played a role in. But the other reality is that it's still definitely not enough. And it's also the reality that sometimes people don't know that these things exist. And so that part right there is like, do we even know who the real leaders are?
Well, I think along those lines, I want to encourage all of our viewers to purchase this book. I haven't read it yet. I just purchased it. I'm going to be giving it away to a young person tomorrow competing in a poetry event, but it's called Martin Luther King Jr. on Leadership, Inspiration, and Wisdom in Challenging Times by Donald T. Phillips. I'm going to check that out. And then I actually already have a copy of A Testament of Hope, which is the essential writings and speeches of Rev Dr. Martin Luther King. Feels like this should be required reading every MLK Day. And you got some time to be able to get through it. It's a thick book. So start with a speech. Start with an essay. Read what he wrote. Read what he was trying to do. Watch some interviews if that's where you got to start. But we got to stop. We got to stop just making it a day of service. We got to make it a day of scholarship, where you're learning about the man for whom the day is named. My greatest strategy. Hope, and his strategy. My greatest hope is that we can do something different by doing something different. Not just accepting. So we got a Juneteenth. Like all the Black holidays that exist now. Now there's Kwanzaa, there's Juneteenth, there's Black History Month, there's Black Music Month, there's Black August, there's MLK Day. So we got 6 opportunities, some of which are a month long, to be learning about the legacy of Black leadership, Black culture, Black activists, Black radicals. Let's use some of that time to actually learn about them. Like the information not hidden. You talked about COINTELPRO. I was just driving in, listening to NPR. They talking about COINTELPRO. It ain't a secret no more. And people ain't
Yeah.
even mad about the fact that the U.S. government was weaponized against the American citizens. They're only mad about it now because the U.S. government was weaponized to protect elected officials from angry parents who threaten their lives. Like, let's be clear. Like, the weaponization of the American government against its citizens, that's called the history of America. It just happens now those citizens don't look like us.
Yeah.
So now it's a problem.
Yeah.
With that being
I
said,
agree. Bring up the other book you mentioned at the beginning. I was trying to Google it, and my internet was acting. They was hating. It was the
Why
government.
We
They
Can't
heard
Wait.
the conversation.
I purchased 7 different books. So the idea is that we got poets that are going to be performing tomorrow, and one of their prizes for making it to the final stage is books. And I'm not gonna lie,
Oh, that's
this was
dope.
inspired by listening to young people's thoughts about MLK's. Like, yo, you need to take Bomani Armand's advice and read several books. So let's start with
Yeah.
these. So we've got Why We Can't Wait. I already shared Martin Luther King Jr. on leadership. I actually purchased this at a local bookstore. I would encourage everyone to go to Mahogany Books, which is, of the 4 places I went, the place that had the most books. And they actually just sent me a text. They found 2 more books after I left. A Testament
That's
of Hope,
dope.
which is a heavy read, but you could literally make this family reading. People take different speeches, different essays, then you come back and talk about it. Redemption, the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last 31 hours. And then Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, Writings and Speeches That Changed the World.
I love it.
There's two more. Then I
Okay.
got the autobiography of Martin Luther King, which doesn't roll as quickly off my tongue as the autobiography of Malcolm X. Because to be honest, I didn't know that there was an autobiography till I found this in the bookstore today. So autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., check it out. And then the last thing was Brothers in Beloved Community, the friendships of Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King Jr. So this idea of internationalizing the work.
Very, very
Right?
cool. There was another book though. The one you said it was the problem with the Negro intellectual. Is that what it's called?
No, it's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual by Harold
Okay.
Cruz. That's just
The
about the civil
crisis
rights
of the
movement.
Negro intellectual.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. Remember that we got a whole reading list. I feel like we could turn Black History Month into Black Strategy Month. I mean,
What?
I think we're ready.
Black Strategy Month.
Yeah.
You about to get the algorithm coming for us. Black. So we
Hashtag Black Strategy Month.
So RBI wanted to know, he said, I just hopped on. Did you list Death of a King by Travis Smiley?
By Tavis Smiley? No, we did not.
I wonder if that's supposed to be Travis or if it's supposed to be Tavis. Speaking of Tavis Smiley, come on, brother, get it together. We need to be able to get all of these leaders back together.
We haven't seen him since he got Me Too'd. I don't know where he's at.
So one other place that we should be thinking about is CBC Week, because you do know that CBC Week was literally created in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King, because the idea was that the point was to have an agenda, not a leader. That if you had an agenda, you couldn't kill an agenda. That the agenda would be advanced regardless of who was there. But then that's where that baton passing that you're talking about comes in, because and he did say it is Tavis Smiley.
Okay.
That baton tossing becomes important because even if you're not passing the baton, you're in government now. Who's in community to hold you accountable? Who's in community to hold? Go ahead.
Now I was going to say, let's talk about that, because I do this environmental justice work. And so there are a lot of people in community when it comes to EJ that are holding these leaders accountable. I do want to big up the EJ for All Act. I do want to big up Donald McKeechin, who, where he rests in peace, who was one of the biggest spearheaders of that, along with Rep Grijalva. And so, there are people that are working to hold it accountable. But in that Black Strategy Month is also a question of do people know how to hold these leaders accountable? Because we do a lot of yelling at the sky, but there's a real strategy. And the people who know that strategy, they're doing a lot. It's hard, but they're doing a lot.
Don't get it twisted. My point is not no one's being held accountable. Nothing's happening. It's just as bad as it was. That's not my argument. My argument is, who are the organizations that are holding people accountable? You talked about them in the environmental justice space. I'm talking about in the racial justice space. Who are the people that are holding them accountable? What are these organizations still doing? Like, they still exist. What are they doing? And maybe that's PR, but maybe that's also that they're not doing nearly as much because their strategy is still rooted, or their priorities are still rooted in the problems of the past, as opposed to retooling to meet the problems of the moment. Maybe. It's at least worth investigating. Maybe that's what we should do. We should make it a priority in February to bring on people from those organizations that we named as legacy civil rights organizations to talk about what they're doing. And maybe by then we'll have an audience of more than 2 people, so they'd actually want to show up.
There we go. I'm here for it. I'm here for it. If we can make that happen, and beyond, I'm here for it. Hashtag Black Strategy Month. You have Black Futures Month. You have Black History Month. But there's no Black strategy. We can't build a future without strategy.
What's Black Futures Month?
That's February. People have been reclaiming Black History Month as Black Futures Month. And I think that's cool. But at the same time, it's like, we need the Sankofa moment. It's okay I think there's this weird space where people live in where they don't want to live in actual time. They want to live in the past, or they want to live in the future, but they don't want to live in time. Like the strategy that's right now. That's the most difficult one. And I think that's where we need to be.
I agree with everything you just said. I think the one place I disagree with you is I think that right now we're also living in a moment where people are ashamed of a past where ancestors survived. That if those ancestors hadn't survived, we would not be here. And there's a lack of gratitude, a lack of understanding of what it really means to survive in what are inhuman conditions. And to come from that, I'm proud to come from that. There's no shame in the fact that we come from survivors. We come from rebellers. We come from people who escaped. We come from people who made it through so that we could make it through. And so, yes, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about the current strategy. And let's not forget about the past, because all these books are about the relevance of the past for today. That saying is still true, no matter who said it, that those who fail to learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. With that said, Carrie, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. It was good to see y'all.
No doubt. All right, everybody. That's episode 22. Just wanted to big up Dr. King for his actual legacy and the people that are doing the work to advance it and to do research about it, to tell people about it, because it's super relevant right now and useful for us to be learning about what's worked and what hasn't. What's worked and what hasn't, and what was deliberately undermined through violence to prevent it from continuing to work. All right? Read some books.
Let me show you how to register for the WBL Combine. First, you're going to go to the Eventbrite app on your phone. In the search bar, you're going to type in the keyword Combine. Now, if your audience, you can select Combine Finals, but if you want to compete, you better click on the prelim registration. Scroll down to the bottom and click the word ticket. Now from there, you will be taken to the ticket page. If you're competing, then click on competitor registration. Scroll on down to those add-ons and you can pick whichever events you like to participate in. Maybe the poetry rap trivia. Maybe you want to recite other people's poetry, but whichever event you choose, make sure that number one, you choose the right age group. And number two, understand that your checkout total will go up by $5 for each event selected. Some of you may have a promo code. If you do, be sure to go back up top and enter that, then hit apply. This should lower your overall total. Now you can hit the word checkout and then enter your personal info on the next page. That should just about do it. Only thing to do after that is invite your people out to the Eaton Hotel on Saturday evening to watch you get busy. I'll see you there.